Welcome to the Culture Lab. I'm your host, Aga Bayer. This podcast helps you turn your company culture into rocket fuel for meaningful growth. It explores how we can make the word work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging. It looks at how we can build remarkable cultures that scale as our businesses grow and the world keeps on changing.
I think the one thing that we can all do is to examine our own biases, our own presumptions. I think we all have to work on our own DEI journey in order to transform cultures and others. And what that takes is making ourselves vulnerable, staying humble. And in my book, there are many stories that I share about my own journey, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I have evolved and my own missteps and lessons learned, because ultimately we're all a work in progress. And if we're going to transform cultures and transform people, we have to first work on ourselves.
Hello, and welcome to episode 82 of the Culture Lab podcast. This episode is brought to you by Culturebrand, a one-of-a-kind global community for leaders and culture champions who want to learn new ways of cultivating remarkable cultures at scale in this brave new world of remote and hybrid work. The Culturebrand community is where we come together to answer some pretty darn hard, ungoogleable questions about culture. And our members get to participate in things like weekly huddles, masterclasses, flash mastermind groups, and talks from world-class experts on culture. And you know many of these experts from this podcast. But most importantly, we facilitate deep peer-to-peer connections. Because making work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging, it's definitely not a task for a single person. It requires tapping into the collective wisdom of bold, kind, and curious culture leaders who are on a mission to redefine and, frankly, decrapify work. So if this sounds like something you'd like to be a part of, check it out at tiny.1/culturebrand. And don't worry, you don't have to write it down. There is a link in the show notes. Let me kick it off with a little bit of personal news. If you receive my newsletter or if you follow me on social media, you probably know that I've lived in Italy for the past 10 years, first in Venice and then in Milan. And they were wonderful, wonderful years. But recently, literally a couple of days ago, we've relocated to Athens in Greece, which is the home of my husband. And so it's quite exciting. And obviously, one of the reasons that I'm sharing this with you is that you can probably hear it because every space is different. The acoustics in our new Athens apartment are definitely different than the acoustics in our Monza apartment. So welcome to this new space. And let's see what happens and how this podcast evolves in this new environment. So today's episode, I want to preface it by saying that, like many people, especially in the Culturebrand community, I'm on a mission. And the mission is making work synonymous with fun, with meaning, and with belonging. And when it comes to cultivating a culture of belonging, nothing is more important than creating a diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplace. And my guest today, Rohini Anand, she's actually someone who was recommended by my husband, who knew her and admired her for years for her work as the Senior Vice President for Corporate Responsibility and the Global Chief Diversity Officer for Sodexo. And Rohini spearheaded a remarkable global culture change in Sodexo. The Culture Change initiative was led by diversity and inclusion, and its story was even featured in Harvard Business School case study. Rohini has recently published a wonderful book called Leading Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And in this interview, we talk about her personal story and also about a few of the principles that enabled her, but also other organizations, to make significant progress. The kind of progress that results in leveling the playing field and creating a workplace culture where anyone can be successful, irrespective of their identity or their background. And even more importantly, the sort of workplace where people can feel like they truly belong. So without further ado, here is Rohini Anand.
I actually worked for several years for Sodexo, a global food and facilities management company with over 460,000 employees. And I led the global diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, as well as was the senior vice president of corporate responsibility for them. And since I rewired in 2020, I've been coaching chief diversity officers, sitting on both for profit and nonprofit boards. Of course, I wrote my book, and then I've been doing a fair number of speaking engagements. So that's who I am in a nutshell.
Wonderful. So before we talk about your book, one more question. It's a question that we always kick off with. And it's a question about your early cultural influences. So if you could tell us a little bit about what culture did you grow up in and what impact did it have on you as a person?
Oh wow, that's my next book. But what I can say, I actually grew up in Mumbai, India, and went to an international school in India. Very much saw myself as a citizen of the world. But the family values were around the importance of family and the importance of education. I think those would be the two key values that I grew up with. My grandfather was an academic. He actually wrote 26 books in his lifetime. So,
Wow.
and my father had actually gone to the United States from India in the 1940s, and he had a scholarship and studied film. And he would tell me, he said, I'd never even held or seen a camera in my life. And I took the scholarship to go because he had a gold medal in physics and, he decided that he'd take the scholarship. And, he went on to work in Hollywood and with the likes of Cary Grant. He shared some sort of wonderful stories with me about his times in the US, but never shared with me his experiences around discrimination, particularly when he traveled through the US South in the 1940s. And that I appreciated that because it allowed me to sort of uncover and discover my own journey when I moved to the US. So that was my family upbringing, oldest of three sisters, very much conditioned that you can be and do what you want to do, but within some cultural norms and parameters, which I broke out of when I moved to North America.
I love the story, and it's such a rich story with such a rich legacy. And wow, so many interesting people in your family. So, how did you decide to move to the US? I think that I can only imagine that that was a major change in your life. Talk to me a little bit about what it was like in terms of potentially, I can imagine a culture shock and then assimilating to your new culture. What was that experience like for you?
As I said, it was my father who actually encouraged me to go to the US when I wanted to do my master's. I had been exposed obviously through media, etc., but more so going to an international school where I had friends from, different parts of the world. So, I had an exposure. I was ready to take on this sort of new challenge. And I actually first went to Canada, and I was 19 years old, single woman, landing on the west coast of Canada. It was a lonely experience initially, but also in some ways a fairly comfortable experience because, I had exposure. And the big part obviously was sort of missing home and family. But it really was truly an inflection point in my journey, both literally and metaphorically, and brought me to the work that I do today. And maybe we can, talk a little bit about more about that. But, the experience it was disruptive for me. It made me question some of my own upbringing and values and explore solutions for myself. But it also made me miss some of those things that had anchored me. It allowed me to really define my own identity in a very new context, and I appreciated that.
Yeah, I love that. And it's such a common experience because as I've mentioned, I asked this question about their early life experiences in every interview. And it's interesting because for most people, they have a similar experience of really realizing their own culture when only when they were immersed in a different culture. And paradoxically, this experience really helped them to define what their identity is. And it seems like it was quite similar in your case. So I'm definitely seeing some common themes there. So absolutely, let's pivot a little bit and dive into, how that experience and potentially other experiences brought you to DEI work. I guess that it was a journey. It wasn't a single event. I would be super interested to learn when was the first time when you realized this is something that I really feel committed to and I actually want to do something about it.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, clearly it was a journey. It wasn't a single event. And, my identity unfolded in a very sort of a complex and nuanced way. As you said rightly, I sort of began to appreciate some things about my own cultural upbringing. And at the same time, I rejected some of the things that I did not appreciate. I imbibed things that I appreciated from the North American culture and rejected others. So it really forged my own identity as a very sort of multidimensional being. But, I mean, this work is very, very personal for me. And I think my sort of journey to this work is, it's sort of my story and it's very integral to who I am. So I mentioned that I grew up in Mumbai, and growing up in Mumbai, almost everyone looked like me. I belonged to the majority religion, Hinduism, and I realize now that surrounded by others like me, I actually had the privilege of not having to think about my identity. It was something I had taken for granted, right? Like a fish in water. I'd taken it for granted. My move to the US, however, was, my inflection point, both literally and metaphorically. And my identity shifted from being a person who saw herself as the center of her world to being a minority, to being an immigrant, and to being a foreigner. So I was identified as an Asian American, and I was totally, completely unprepared for that. So it was only when I was identified as a minority and I realized the privileges that came with being part of a majority, including not having to think about my identity. I was part of the majority growing up in India, and I hadn't recognized any of my privileges in that way. And I was quite frankly unable to until I was perceived as a minority and I experienced things differently. So, I think it was that experience that led me to the research that I did, to my PhD in terms of, movement of people and identity formation, and the realization that identity is situational, that it's fluid, basically informed my research and still continues to inform the work that I do. So, my work is very personal to me. Understanding what it means to be perceived as an outsider is very much at the core of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so it was then that I sort of decided that I wanted to do research in this. But then when I did my research, for me, it wasn't, I wanted to see it applied. And that's when I started moving into the realm of being a practitioner. And really, my work became more about leveling the playing field so that everyone could succeed, so removing barriers and ensuring everyone could succeed. So today, I think that, I like to say that my vocation and my avocation are perfectly aligned.
What a wonderful place to be in. Yeah. And, I also think that it's wonderful that you are able to see this issue of identity from both sides because it's wonderful that you've had this experience of never having to think about your identity early on during your life. Because I can only imagine it probably gives you empathy for majority groups who struggle sometimes to acknowledge their own privilege. And then obviously, in the second part of your life, being a minority and being perceived as a minority, it gives you a window and an insight into what it means to be considered a part of minority. And not a lot of people have this experience. of both sides. So would you say that indeed it helps you to understand both sides, and it potentially makes you more empathetic?
I think that's an excellent point, really very good point. And I do think that having had that experience gives me a window and insight into both sides. And when I find myself getting impatient with those that have privilege and don't recognize their privilege, I have to remind myself about my own identity shifting journey. So you're absolutely right. Yeah, that's an excellent point.
Rohini, for the sake of our listeners, I'd love us to start with some definitions first, because not everyone might be entirely clear what we mean when we say diversity, what we mean when we say equity, and what we mean when we say inclusion. Could you offer us your definitions of these three terms?
Sure. And, I have defined them in the book. And to me, diversity is sort of that mix, the demographic mix of people, including those from marginalized or underrepresented groups, however it's defined in whatever location you're in, because every location has its dominant and non-dominant groups. Equity, on the other hand, refers to really eliminating systemic barriers that prevent or inhibit the full participation of people and equal access to opportunities. And then inclusion is the act of creating a work culture where individuals can participate fully because those systemic barriers have been removed. And what we want as an outcome to that inclusive culture is one in which employees feel or experience a sense of belonging because of who they are and not in spite of who they are. So they feel the sense of belonging, and the uniqueness is embraced. And ultimately, we want to level the playing field for everyone and lead to social justice. So,
I love this, particularly this one word, because of who they are, not in spite of who they are. And it sounds so simple, and yet it is so incredibly difficult. So, to give a little bit more context, even, and sort of encourage our listeners to continue listening, could you speak a little bit to this question that many people have? Is this really good for business, or is it just a moral imperative, or both?
yeah, so I don't think it's an either or. I do think we know that it's the right thing to do. We know it's about social justice. We know that it's a moral imperative. But it also is good for business, like many other things. But there's a library of research that demonstrates the impact of more women and more ethnic diversity in leadership and financial outcomes. So they're not causation studies, but they're certainly correlation studies by Catalyst, Credit Suisse, McKinsey, and there's a lot of data there that shows this correlation. In fact, at Sodexo, we did our own study. So we looked at data from 50,000 managers in over 70 entities around the world.
Wow.
And we looked at what we call gender balanced teams, or teams with 40 to 60% women. And what we found that was that in those gender balanced teams, with a equal representation of men and women, they outperformed those with less than 40% women on several of the key performance indicators, including, if I can get this right, employee engagement, employee retention, client retention, financial outcomes, and safety, interestingly enough. But when you get to more than 60% women, the results start plateauing off. So the important piece here is that optimum mix, of both genders. And I'm talking about essentially right now, I'm basically looking at binary gender only because that's what we could measure globally.
Mhm.
Clearly there's a correlation there. The other piece is there's a lot of research that suggests the impact of diversity on innovation. So diverse perspectives, diverse thinkings born out of diverse life experiences and diverse identities impact positively on innovation. The other piece, of course, is retention and engagement of talent, right? When you have an inclusive culture, you are able to retain and engage talent, which leads to increased productivity. So inclusion and belonging are extremely important to talent. In fact, there was a study done recently by McKinsey, and they looked at 5 countries, including the US, UK, Australia, etc. And what they found was that this whole notion of the great resignation right now. And what keeps employees anchored to an organization is that culture of inclusion, including flexibility, but also a sense of belonging to an organization.
Yeah.
So, if you want to stop that great resignation, that culture has to change in order to allow people from all backgrounds to feel the sense of belonging. And then I would say the customer piece, the customer employees are getting more and more diverse. If you want the best talent, you've got to widen the net and get the best talent, with increased competition. But also, your customers are getting more and more diverse. So, to be able to understand them, market to them, you need diverse perspectives. And I'll just close with one quick one. For Sodexo, the business case was about its clients. So for Sodexo, diversity, equity, and inclusion became a differentiator and a competitive advantage to reach out to clients, to retain clients, and to get new clients. So I think all of those definitely, it is a business imperative, undoubtedly.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I've recently come across a very interesting research as well done by a think tank called Coquity, and it aligns with everything that you've said. And it looked at the perceived sense of belonging of employees and all these indicators: retention, talent attraction, engagement, career progress. Everything was incredibly positively impacted by that perceived sense of belonging of employees. So there's plenty of research, plenty of evidence that this is really, really good for business. And I think that in some countries, another barrier to really set this as a priority for the business is the sense that perhaps DEI is more of a thing that is important for countries like the US, where there is a history of racial problems, et cetera, et cetera. And so in many companies, and when I talk to people around the globe, I think that sense of urgency is not equal. And so I was so pleased when I started reading your book and saw the way you open your first chapter, because basically you say every country has its own legacy of hurt, and every place has its history of exclusion, discrimination, and its web of attitudes and systems that fuel and justify marginalization. So, Rohini, could you please elaborate on why it's so important to understand your local context and your local legacy of hurt when you are thinking of drafting a DEI strategy or just addressing these issues in your own company?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And what I will say is that any DEI change effort has to be anchored in an understanding of the local context. It has to be rooted in those, local particulars. It has to be informed by the history, the culture, the language, the laws in each place, because eventually how identity is defined, how it's perceived, how it's expressed, differs. And we have to be aware of those power dynamics and identify the dominant and subordinate groups, whoever they are, because that's what leads to the discrimination and that legacy of hurt. So every environment could have different dominant and subordinate groups. So with that understanding of the context, I mean, that's really the first step in finding strategies to advance underrepresented groups locally, regardless of who they are. So if I can just give you a quick example, if you look at, you mentioned race, right? And race and racism are very fluid and they are shaped by the culture and the history. So you can't take this cookie cutter approach. You've got to understand the local context if you're going to dismantle racism. But racism shows up and is expressed in different ways. So it's often tangled up with ethnicity, with religion, with caste, which take on a more prominent role than race sometimes. And you're right, in the US, race has been the driving force, but elsewhere, race might be just one of several identities that divide or play a less dominant role, or they may be intersectional with other identities that are more prominent. So, if we expect racism to be expressed in the manner in which we are familiar, so if the only sort of understanding of racism is it's about black white issues, we're going to miss important entry points. India, where I come from, for example, discrimination against the lowest caste. discrimination against religious minorities in India, right? Or ethnic undertones in politics in many countries in Africa, or discrimination against the Roma people in parts of Europe. So I think we've got to sort of expand and use more of a multifocal lens, but it ultimately is about understanding the local context, understanding how identity and dominant and subordinate groups and power dynamics and power structures play out in the local context. So, you've got to understand that local context to effectively advance DEI, or, you know, it won't be relevant. Your efforts won't be relevant. They'll fail. Or at the worst scenario is be rejected as an imperialist import, right? Cultural imperialism. So that understanding is very critical.
It is. And I imagine that probably it's incredibly important for the leaders in an organization to be the group that is initially committed to this and does the difficult work and the heavy lifting of understanding. And also, then after acknowledging those minority groups, becoming allies to these groups.
Mm.
And I know that for people who are listening to this, they might be asking themselves, because for me, there is a lot of good intentions and very little understanding of what we can practically do. So if you could speak to how can the people who listen to this become better allies for marginalized groups in their country, in their company? Do you have any tips?
Yeah, there are plenty of tips in the book, Leading Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. But I think, the first step is understanding the context. You talked about the legacy of hurt, right? So understanding the legacy of hurt, understanding the history. And then it doesn't mean that you have to accept the status quo. It doesn't mean that you have to say that this is how it is and so nothing can change. I really believe that outside influence can be catalyst for change. And outsiders can raise issues that those within the culture may not see. I mean, you talked about that fish in water, right? I didn't recognize my own privilege and identity till I moved outside. So those in culture may not see it or may not be able to sometimes raise those issues because of power dynamics, because they may be very charged issues. So, with that understanding, I think change agents, allies, can use their outsider perspective to really push for change. But I think the important piece is that inside outside kind of dynamic. They need to really balance their enthusiasm with a very careful consideration of how and when and where to enter the conversation. They have to examine their own presumptions. And to be honest, this kind of outside allyship works best when it empowers the work of local diversity champions or local change agents, because those insiders or local change agents can be careful but also know how to kind of navigate the landscape. So I think that inside outsider kind of partnership is critical. Let me just give you two very, very quick practical examples, right? So, because I think it's in the stories that these things come to take shape and come to light and come
It's
alive,
true.
right? So, one of them is, there are several multinational companies in Singapore, which is not an LGBTQ friendly country.
Yeah.
And Barclays, Google, and several other multinationals actually joined together to sponsor the Pink Dot Festival in Singapore. And this was to demonstrate allyship for the LGBT community in Singapore. Now, at one point, the Singaporean government clamped down and prevented Western companies or non Singaporean companies, non local companies from being involved in the festival. But what had happened was they had brought their outsider perspective, had created this disruption of the status quo. And by the time the Singaporean government clamped down, there were over 100 local companies that had taken on the baton and carried forward. So they were able to, this insider outsider piece is critical because it had created some disruption of the status quo. The other example that I have is, a business leader who went to Saudi Arabia, and he says I was a guest in Saudi, and he said, what I saw didn't align with my values in terms of how women were treated.
Mhm.
But he conformed with Sharia law in Saudi, and he hired women when the government started opening up and you could hire women to work. So he hired women, they were in a separate space. You could only enter the space with a chaperone. You spoke through an intercom with them, etc. Now, Ireland gained their footing. They wanted to be more involved in meetings and in business discussions, and they needed to be if they would grow in the organization. So it was clear that they needed to meet with men. But the more conservative Saudi men basically said, no, they can't meet with men unless there's a Muslim or a Saudi man present at that meeting. This leader basically put the onus back on them, those that were most resistant. And he said, okay, I understand that. So do you want to accompany them to every single meeting? If you have the time to do that, that's great. But they, of course, said, no, we don't. And they came up with a solution. And the solution was simple but disruptive, that they can meet with men so in an office so long as the door is open and they're sitting at two ends of the desk. So it was a simple but disruptive solution, but helped to get the women involved in the organization and help them actually move up in the organization. So this is that insider outsider kind of partnership that I talk about. And to be honest, sometimes the social justice approach seems like it's coming in conflict with the culturally, locally driven approach. But, it really doesn't have to be either or. And in fact, what I say in the book as well is that diversity, equity, and inclusion embodies both social justice and a locally driven approach with, both of these values like no other discipline. So
Mm.
I think there are many ways to be an ally.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would definitely encourage our listeners to get the book and read more because there are wonderful examples there of how you can be a better ally. But I want to pick up on a point that you've mentioned about resistance, because obviously, always when you introduce initiatives like this, you are met with resistance. And in your book, you talk about this. You talk about some common beliefs and certain mindsets that definitely impact the way leaders and people in organizations react to some of these initiatives. And, to be honest, even just in my conversations with my friends, with clients, I hear this a lot. And, a very common comment that you hear in conversations, especially in Europe, I guess, when there is a lot of focus on gender equity, people say things like, well, now only women get promoted. So as a man, I have zero chance basically to get my promotion until they get the quota. And it's a real issue. That's how people see this. So what are some good strategies to shift this and potentially some other limiting mindsets that you might observe in your company?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And as you know, in the book, there are two full chapters on influential leaders and, many, many examples. So I think the primary thing here is that you have to meet leaders where they are, really understand their ecosystem of beliefs, and then select the strategy that resonates for them, and this might be, you have to understand what's in it for them, right? And then move along. And this may be head strategy. So it could be data, it could be the business case, whatever that is. And for some, that resonates, for others, it doesn't. But ultimately, what moves people, what moves leaders is the heart, right? You have to
Mm.
give them those experiences. So, I mean, the couple of sort of head strategies that I have found effective and that I talk about in the book, the client piece that I talked about, with Sodexo, what I found was that for leaders, you talk about the sense of belonging in terms of sense of belonging to an organization. But there's also a desire to belong to a group of prestigious companies or clients. And if they're leaders in diversity, equity, and inclusion, then that's what you want to do and emulate and
Mm.
be part of. So I would bring in key clients of Sodexo's to talk about this
Mm.
topic, and the leaders would get engaged because they say, "Oh, this is a client of ours. If this is important to them, this is something that we need to then emulate." The other thing that, in terms of head strategies, right, is having allies who are of the dominant group carry your message for you. You don't have to do
Mhm.
all the work. I'm a woman, I'm an Asian immigrant to the United States. People sometimes expect to hear these messages from me. But if I have someone from the dominant group, and usually that, at least in this country, it's a white male, carry my message for me, it's heard differently.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a double-edged sword, right? So you have a validation from the dominant group, so you're being validated by the power brokers, but I think you have to carefully manage that and ensure agency for the marginalized group, right? Because what you're doing is to use power to upend power in some senses, right?
Yeah.
So the other one is awards. When you get recognition and awards, it gives leaders credit. They feel proud and they want to do more. So those are some of those heart strategies. But I'm just going to share a story or two in terms of getting at the heart, right? Those are the head strategies. I may have said heart, but I meant head. Getting to some of those heart where really it causes a disruption in your worldview that makes you lead with purpose and passion, right? So maybe this one story would could illustrate it. So one of the former CEOs of Sodexo, when we launched the gender strategy, we launched it, we were, doing well. But I also talked about the importance of race and ethnicity. And he said to me once, he said, why are you diluting the focus on gender? Because race doesn't translate, all over the world. And he was right. It doesn't translate in the same way as it does in the US. He was a French male. And as there's a very different understanding of race in many parts of Europe, including in France. But I also realized that I needed to kind of expand his worldview on this topic and get him to realize the importance of race, particularly in the United States. So I invited him to a meeting of an employee resource group in the US, the African American Employee Resource Group. And he attended the meeting. He was one of the only white men, only French men in that room. And he
Mm.
listened to stories of he was in a breakout with African American men, with black men. He listened to their stories. And he came away from there completely, his worldview had been disrupted, fair amount of introspection. And he realized both the centrality, the importance of this particular aspect of diversity. And, he went on then to issue a really heartfelt statement after the murder of George Floyd going viral, something he may not have done before. He also went on to really ask some very penetrating questions during talent review, etc. So his worldview had definitely been disrupted. He had seen the importance of race in the United States. So that's sort of how you reach out to leaders, how you give them the experience. I think the head
Mm.
is important, but ultimately I'll give you one other very quick example.
Yeah, please do.
A leader in Europe, he didn't believe in the business case. He had seen all the data, the Sodexo data, and he said, yeah, okay. But I knew that he basically wanted to have this sense of belonging with companies that were elite companies. So I got him involved in a cross company mentoring program. So he was interacting with other CEOs, and that's what the hook was for him. And he mentored a woman from a different company, developed a very trusting relationship with her. She was in the C suite, she got laid off. She shared with him her experiences being the only woman in the C suite, being laid off. And he came to me after that experience and he said, I cannot believe that women have these experiences in the workplace. He said,
Mm.
this is ridiculous. It's crazy. It's unacceptable. Someone who had not believed that there was a difference in treatment of men and women or opportunities for men and women. So he said, I want every one of my executive team members to mentor a woman and sponsor her. So, not only did it cause disruption for himself, but he then led with that purpose and passion,
Yeah.
change the systems that had to bring about change in his organization.
Hmm.
But just one comment on this. So I think very often it's the stories that move people, but we have to be very careful because asking people to share their lived experiences takes a toll on them.
Hmm.
Have to ensure that we're doing it and really maximizing each story's impact, allowing it to be voluntary, but also leaders need to take responsibility for their own learning.
Yeah, this is such an important point. And it aligns with what I have seen and what I have experienced myself as well when it comes to culture change. So ultimately, what really disrupts, as you say, people's mindset or worldview is either an experience when they are immersed in a situation that becomes a first-hand experience, and there is simply no substitute for that. Or at least, as you say, a story that is being shared by someone who has this lived experience, and being in the presence of someone that is sharing that story is incredibly powerful as well.
You're absolutely right. And the piece that I sort of slipped my mind is that it was the first time that he had probably experienced being a minority in that setting. And it was
Mm,
disruptive. So it was a story and that experience of being
the only,
white French man
yeah,
in that environment. So yeah, you're right.
makes total sense. And so I think one final question before we switch gears and move to the rapid fire questions. There are a lot of leaders right now all over the world who are very mindful of the need to bring in more diverse talent into their organization. And very often, what I hear, I wonder, first of all, if it's your experience as well, but what I hear very often is I really struggle. I cannot find diverse talent that we need in our organization. And so, what do you have to say to that? And perhaps some strategies that leaders might implement to be able to find and hire people from different backgrounds?
Yeah, so I think, clearly there are many, many, many qualified candidates out there. I think that leaders need to cast the net wide and ultimately hire the best qualified. But they have to look at non traditional places. And what that means is sort of expanding your worldview, right? And looking at places where you traditionally may not have looked for talent. I also think that the other piece is that I think that leaders need to ensure that they're removing bias from the entire recruiting process,
Mm,
all of the talent processes actually. So they've got to infuse DEI in all of those processes. You talked about sort of the book with the five principles. So one of the principles that we've talked about, or two of them so far, are make it local, which was the one about localizing. The second one was about leaders change to lead change, where leaders just disrupt their worldview. One of the others is go deep, wide, and inside out. And what I mean by that is that diversity, equity, and inclusion has to be infused into all of the systems and processes in an organization in order to remove bias, from the recruiting process. So, how interviews are done, how accents are received, how resumes are reviewed. Are they rejected because of someone's name or because of an address? Those things have to be removed from the recruiting process. And I think leaders have to examine their own bias. A quick story on that. So, one particular leader was mentoring a woman who was managing high security prisons. And he came to me after that, and she had a very different leadership style. She was basically more collaborative, a much softer leadership style. And he came to me after that experience, after mentoring her, and sort of supported her promotion. And he said, if you had presented me with two candidates, a male and a female, to manage a high security prison, I would have chosen the male regardless, because it's a dangerous situation. You need an assertive, aggressive style. He said, after mentoring her, and she's so effective, I will never let that happen again. So here he was, examining his own unconscious biases. And I think leaders need to do that. So the candidates are there, but
yeah.
something that stops us. And then I think lastly, branding your company as an inclusive company that diverse talent seeks out. Because today, in many parts of the world, talent has choices. Younger generations will go to those companies that embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion. So brand yourself as a leader. I know that at Sodexo, that was something we did. And, we would have women who were engineers who had choices to go to any company, the IBMs, the big brands of the world, but they chose to go to Sodexo often because they felt that they could advance their careers because the commitment that the company had at the time. I think that there's plenty of opportunity to hire diverse talent. It's a question of positioning.
Hmm. And I also love this point that you've made. It just occurred to me as you were speaking that putting someone in a position of being a mentor to someone that maybe they wouldn't naturally support is again a sort of experience that probably shapes their identity because suddenly you find yourself in a position of an ally of a female executive simply because you are a mentor to her. So it not only exposes you to incredible and potentially unique strengths of this particular individual, but it also really allows you to see yourself differently. So I find this incredibly interesting and insightful in terms of how we can help people shape their identities in a way that supports all these DEI efforts that they might want to, but there are a lot of internal barriers that people need to work through.
Yeah, and the other example that I shared about the executive who was coaching a woman from a different company. So you kind of wonder who is the mentor here, right?
Yeah.
It's more of a reciprocal mentoring initiative
Hmm.
where you're sort of learning and teaching both ways.
Exactly. Absolutely. So, Rohini, thank you so much for this. Of course, we could not possibly do justice to your book in such a short time. So, again, I encourage everyone to get it and read it and then read it again and maybe have it on your desk and refer to it from time to time. I'd like us now to shift gears and move to our rapid fire questions section. And this is when I ask you 5 questions in rapid succession. And the idea is that you will attempt to answer all these questions in under 2 minutes.
Mm.
So it will be really, really fast moving. The first question is, according to you, Rohini, what is the sign or perhaps signs multiple that a company culture needs some work or perhaps even a major overhaul?
Yeah, I mean, I think clearly retention of, and in this case, of underrepresented people, when that's an issue, when the brand has been damaged, when leaders make insensitive comments, and it all shows up in a way that diversity is not intentional in the organization. There are isolated initiatives, and there are performative actions and statements made versus sustainable progress where diversity is infused in all the processes. But it shows up around, with retention, engagement, damaged brand, leaders who are not allies and make insensitive comments. 2 minutes? I think so.
Yes, but we have 4 more questions to go.
Okay.
So let's see. Do you admire any companies for their culture? And if yes, why?
So I'm not sure that I can really answer that question because what I believe is any company has a best practice at a point in time. And this can change very quickly because the external social justice journey is evolving and the goalpost changes. So I think that at a moment in time, there may be a best practice, but I think this keeps changing. And I also think that they may have a good culture for some for a period of time. And I think these journeys go up and down, leaders change, intentionality slips, companies get distracted. So I'm not sure that I can say there's one company that I think really has done this in a way that's, sustained for the long haul. So I'll just stop there.
Fair enough. And what books on culture, on leadership, on DEI would you recommend aside of your book, obviously, that I recommend wholeheartedly?
I think there's several books out there. I think Jennifer Brown has some books. There's another book called Equity. And of course, my book, Leading
Hmm.
Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, a guide for systemic change in multinational organizations. So
A good list to start. So, finally, final question. What is one thing that our listeners can do, perhaps even tomorrow, to build their own culture lab and start cultivating a culture that will help them and their teams to bring their vision to life?
I think the one thing that we can all do is to examine our own biases, our own presumptions. I think we all have to work on our own DEI journey in order to transform cultures and others. And what that takes is making ourselves vulnerable, staying humble. I and in my book there are many stories that I share about my own journey,
Hmm.
diversity, equity, and inclusion. I have evolved and my own missteps and lessons learned because ultimately we're all a work in progress. And if we're going to transform cultures and transform people, we have to first work on ourselves.
Yeah, so true.
One more statement, I really do believe that change happens, transformation happens at the intersection of people and systems. And it's work that's ongoing. So I think we have to impact those systems, but we have to impact people, and that starts with ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we can all identify these moments. I just want to give an example so that our listeners can think of a similar situation in their lives in an area where we think we are definitely not biased. So for me, obviously, I've always thought of myself as someone who promotes women and doesn't have any bias, obviously, when it comes to gender. And then I found myself in a situation when a very good friend of mine was diagnosed with breast cancer. And obviously, it was a very painful experience, tragic for her and for her family and all friends. And we were talking, and I was really upset. And it was a little bit ridiculous because she was trying to help me work through that emotion at some point. And she said, "Hey, don't worry. I really have the best surgeon possible who's going to operate on me." And I said, "Well, I hope he knows that he has a super important person in his hands." And she said, "Hey, what's your bias? It's not him, it's her."
Mm,
And that was such a powerful moment for me because I realized deep, deep, deep down inside, I just assumed that the best surgeon would be male.
hmm
And so that was my light bulb moment when I realized, oh, I have more biases deeply rooted in my psyche than I would like to admit. So I'm encouraging everyone who's listening to the podcast to think about where their biases might lie and really look in those dark corners where you don't even think that you might be biased, but I'm sure you are because we all are. We are all human and we all have our biases. Rohini, thank you so, so much for this conversation. If our listeners want to learn more about you or the book, what is the best place online for them to go to?
I think my website, rohinianand.com, is the best place. You can order the book on Amazon, on Book Depository, Barnes and Noble, and I think Porchlight has bulk order available. So there's many options both in your country as well as in the US, but I would say that my website, rohinianand.com, is the best place to learn more about the book. And do order the book and please write a review. I would really appreciate that.
Yeah, it's so important for all creators, really, if you appreciate our work, write reviews because it really helps others to find these great books that really help, or great podcasts, by the way, that help you in your work. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Rohini. I really appreciate you. I appreciate your work. It's such incredibly important field, especially right now, and a great opportunity, I believe, to really leverage all this knowledge and ideas because the world is listening, I think, more carefully right now. So if you are in your organization thinking about investing more time and energy in this, I'd really encourage you. Now is the time. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
I'm Aga Bayer, the creator and host of the Culture Lab podcast, and this is the Culture Lab team.
Production Manager, Lindsay Nunez.
Sound producer, Heather McPherson, Twisted Spur Media.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Culture Lab podcast. Rohini and I hope that it will inspire you to think broader and deeper about the D&I agenda in your company. And if you'd like an opportunity to interact with people like her in live sessions where you can learn more on the topic, this is just one of many benefits you'd enjoy if you were a member of the Culturebrand community. Culturebrand is one-of-a-kind global community for culture leaders who look for new ways of cultivating remarkable cultures in this brave new world of remote and hybrid work. If you are in charge of a culture-shaping project, and if you believe that work should be synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging, you'd probably feel right at home in our community. It's a diverse group of culture leaders from Fortune 100 to tiny startups on a rapid growth trajectory. And what brings us together is a passion for cultivating a healthy culture at scale. And we are guided by our values of being bold, being kind, and being curious. And we'd love for you to join us if it feels like the right fit. You can learn more about the community at tiny.one/culturebrand. and you'll find a link in the show notes. And now, a quick preview of the upcoming episode. My next guest is someone I had loads and loads of fun doing the interview with, Rohini Evans. Rohini is a partner at The Ready, an org design and transformation consultancy that helps companies change the way they work. And we already had Aaron Dignan, Rodney's partner and the author of The Brave New Work, on the show. And this time, Rodney and I talk about self-managed teams and outcome-based cultures. In this short snippet, Rodney talks about how you can create your own culture lab and experiment with doing things differently and better.
Think about something that bugs you about work, ideally, over which you have control. Don't go try to enroll a team in your new idea or your experiment or get sign off from your boss. Just think about something about your day. Maybe it's a meeting that you've gone to every week for 2 years where you've never said anything and where you don't think anyone would actually notice if you're there, and just try not going to that meeting and see if something happens.
Thanks for tuning in and listening to this episode of the Culture Lab podcast. If you found any moments that were interesting, inspiring, or maybe even game-changing, please share this episode with someone who'd appreciate it. After all, good ideas are meant to be shared. If you haven't subscribed to the Culture Lab yet, you can do it on any podcast streaming platform of your choice. If you want to receive our weekly insights on cultivating a remarkable, powerful, and authentic company culture, especially in a business that scales, type this into your browser. tinyurl.com/agabayer. That's tinyurl.com/AGABAJER. Also, we would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review our podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to it. And finally, the entire Culture Lab team and our guests, we are going to continue exploring how we can make the word work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging, and how we can build remarkable cultures that scale as our businesses grow and the world keeps on changing. So, what do you want to hear about next? What matters to you? Email us at lindsay@agabayer.com and let us know.